Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's July 14th, 2024. Before we get into today's topics, we have to pass comment on the JFKing that we not so novelly predicted would be a logical next step in the progression of the establishment in keeping Donald Trump from getting back into the White House. And that appears to have played out at least one iteration of it, which was fortunately unsuccessful, and details are still coming in. There's going to be a lot more that will be made clear in the days and weeks to come. Online sleuths have done what they so reliably do now in the internet age, for those who are willing to look away from the corporate stenographers of the establishment and find the primary sources before they're able to be curated and collated and disappeared. There are multiple people who were in attendance at the rally who saw a guy bear crawling up on a building that was a field and a half away from where Trump was speaking, and it was in pretty clear sight of many of those people who were in attendance at the rally, and they were pointing to police and to Secret Service, indicating that there was somebody on the roof with a rifle, and it appeared that either through dereliction or potentially through a green flag operation that he had sufficient time to set his sight, aim, and take multiple shots before he was molested by the snipers that the Secret Service had in place. Allegedly, the Trump administration has been asking for increased security detail from the Secret Service, which is under the purview of the Department of Homeland Security, and it has not been forthcoming. Jeff pointed out to me that the Secret Service is no more immune than any other government or corporate or academic body when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the head of the Secret Service back in 2023, there's an interview in which she puts forward as a driving objective for the Secret Service to meet of having at least 30% of Secret Service officers and personnel being female. There are no shortage of, painfully and tragically, humorously, of women in positions of law enforcement being met by the physical realities of male strength, dominance over females, especially when it comes to upper body strength, but in martial prowess more generally. So those are some additional factors on top of the apparent failure of the Secret Service on the ground to respond to alerts from members of the public when ostensibly the Secret Service is supposed to be hyper vigilant about potential threats and is supposed to case an area to identify all of the potential spots that snipers could enjoy a straight line to, not just the main event, but to the general public who are in attendance. And given the close proximity of the building that the shooter was on and the fact that it was visible from the event stage and noticed by those who were in attendance, suggests to me that the most likely explanation is that the directive has gone out from the higher-ups at the alphabet agencies that some deep-seated organic opposition to Donald Trump manifests in a lethal form, that it can be permitted to proceed. It might sound like I'm splitting hairs here, but that's not the intention. I don't think we are quite to the JFK stage yet. Subsequent details from this assassination attempt may come out that prove me wrong, but at this point, my guess is this now deceased shooter was not a spook or an informant. He was a mentally unstable, unhinged resistance lunatic. And speaking of lunatics, that segues well enough into the major topic of discussion for today's cast. Setting the stage for that, here's a rather jarring clip. Jarring at least for those inside the vaginal line, those of Northwestern European ancestry. I don't know where this clip is from. Based on the accent of one of the people who's being accosted in public, it sounds like it's from somewhere in Scandinavia, Norway, or Sweden. We'll listen to the audio here to set the stage. There is someone recording, and in camera view is a white woman and a man of apparent subcontinental Indian descent. And they're in some big box store. It looks like a Home Depot's or a Lowe's or whatever the Scandinavian equivalent is.
Are you not ashamed of yourself? You're with the world's most invasive species. You're the world's most irresponsible breeders. You're in the whitest country possible.
What do you mean? Everyone's in color?
Yes. You're a biological weapon in this country. Hey, Pajit, you're a biological weapon in this country. And you should be ashamed of yourself. You're a white woman. What are you going to do? Mix your genetics up with the shit skin?
What do you mean?
What do you mean, what do I mean? There's 1.3 billion of those fucking Pajits.
What are you talking about me like that?
There's 1.3 billion Pajits.
Just leave us, okay?
This is the whitest country
Please
on
leave
earth.
us.
You should be ashamed of yourself.
Leave us. Okay?
Be ashamed of yourself.
What are you doing?
Be ashamed. Look at you.
What are you doing?
Why don't you have some more classes?
Pretty vulgar stuff. At least it hits me that way, but it would, given my demographic characteristics. But the reality is that sentiment, if not one held by a majority of the global population, is certainly one that has adherents numbering in the billions. Not in the specifics of the country in question, with regard to of European descent being settled by South Asian immigrants, but in terms of interracial pairings more generally. The World Values Survey, the largest and several decade running organization that administers surveys to several tens of countries in waves, believe the survey is currently on its 8th wave, or is currently conducting the 8th wave. The data we're going to use is from the 7th wave, which ran from 2017 to 2022. So this is recent data. These numbers are fresh. And the way the surveys are conducted is interviewers go and speak with several thousand people in a country, and they do the same thing that polling organizations do in terms of obtaining representative samples for the battery of questions that they administer. And it's a long survey. There are several different questions asked, and the answers to those questions can be cross-referenced to some basic demographic characteristics, but also just by national origin. And one of the questions they asked in the 7th wave was whether or not respondents would like to have neighbors who are of a different race than their own. Okay, but we're talking about interracial couplings, not just living next to someone. Obviously, living next to someone is different than living with someone, and being neighborly with someone is different than being intimate with someone. But there were no questions from the World Value Survey posed directly asking about interracial intimate relationships. However, this ports well as a proxy for that. Intuitively, the results here would tend to understate the rate of opposition to interracial coupling, because presumably a person could tolerate having someone of a different race as a neighbor, but the personal standards would be higher and be more discriminating marriage and family formation. And fortunately, the results that we get from the World Value Survey, which includes the United States as one of the 65 countries where the 7th wave of the World Value Survey was conducted, And in that survey, the percentage of Americans who expressed a desire not to have a neighbor of a different race than their own came in at 3.0%. Domestically, in the United States, surveys asking about interracial marriage find, one I'm looking at here from 2021, finds an approval rate of 94%, so an opposition to interracial marriage is 6%. The World Value Survey for having someone of a different race being a neighbor comes in at 3%, whereas the opposition to having someone of a different race as a marriage partner comes in at 6%. So the intuition we had looks like it's exactly correct. In the case of the United States, people are about twice as likely to oppose interracial marriage as they are to oppose racially integrated neighborhoods. Opposition to both are fringe positions in American society and in the Anglosphere more broadly, but not so much outside of the Western world. So as a rough estimate, I'd like to use a factor of 2 from opposition to having neighbors of a different race to opposition to interracial marriage, but that presumption bumps up against mathematical limits in the case of Myanmar and Vietnam. Myanmar comes in at 70.4% of respondents being opposed to having neighbors who are of a different race. So again, under the understanding that that is going to be a low-end estimate of opposition to interracial couplings, what in an earlier age would have been referred to as miscegenation, but that term has since become taboo. It's the low end of the estimate. Again, you're not going to be willing to marry someone who you're not even willing to have as a neighbor. So Myanmar at over 70%, Vietnam at 62%, the United States at 3%. Turkey comes in at 41%, Lebanon 36%, Bulgaria at 33%, Georgia also at 33%, and not the state of Georgia. The state of Georgia, that racist old Confederate state, that state is in a country where the percentage of respondents opposed to interracial anything comes in single digits. Now, this is Georgia, the Georgia that the Western corporate media loves, because this is a Georgia that is opposed to Russia. In that Georgia, a country that is whiter than the United States, opposition to interracial marriage is a sentiment felt by an order of magnitude higher proportion of the population than in the United States. Thailand 32%, Bangladesh 32%, Iraq 32%. It's worth noting with Iraq that consanguinity rates in Iraq have been estimated to approach 50% of the population. What that means is nearly half of Iraqis who are married to a second cousin or closer. And so in Iraq, we may have to make an exception for the factor of 2 estimation technique we've been employing, because in the case of Iraq, it could be your cousin today, your neighbor tomorrow, and your wife next week. In societies where entire neighborhoods are tribal and consanguinity is high, the idea of having a neighbor or a spouse who is a different race is more of a hypothetical than a real-world consideration on the ground that has to be contended with. Iran, 28%, Armenia, 27%. And we get the idea that American cultural imperialism still has a lot of work to do, because there are major countries in the so-called global South that have much different ideas of integration than Westerners do. So we won't go through all 65 countries. But speaking of major countries in the global South, pointing out India comes in at 25%, so a quarter of Indians, which India has a population of 1.3 billion people. So we're talking about over 300 million people, quite close to 330 million people, in fact. which is a figure you might recognize because it is the ballpark figure of the total American population. So in a country of over 1 billion people, of India's size, there is a population that matches person for person the entire United States population, who are opposed to having a neighbor who is a different race than their own. In China, another country with over 1 billion people, the figure comes in at 18%. To reiterate, that's the percentages of respondents who say they would not want someone of a different race as a neighbor. Certainly the percentages who would not want to have a marriage partner of a different race are significantly higher than that. To address the question less clinically and instead step into the mind frame of the person who recorded that video harassing the white woman with the South Asian male partner and shaming her for dating outside of her own race, there's a sense in which she is making a quite rational calculation on the fly. A lot of this is happening presumably at the subconscious level, but that from a selection perspective, from a Darwinian perspective, that doesn't matter in the scheme of things in terms of how the next generation comes about. If Western men are supine and supplicating, failing to assert themselves martially or genetically in the face of significant population changes within their own native lands, if they are, to put it bluntly, if perhaps more figuratively than literally, at least at this point, if they are unwilling or incapable of repelling the invasion, well, what happens to men who are on the losing side of an invasion? They end up on their stomachs with spears through their backs. Women, however, are able to land on their backs with a different kind of spear, very much making them feel alive and allowing them to pass that life force on to the next generation. In a world, too, where whiteness is increasingly considered a mark of shame and derision and disdain, and increasingly also a deserving target of vengeance for giving the world so much and for asking so relatively little in return, that the resentment it engenders makes the prospects for a blonde-haired, blue-eyed child worse than the prospects for a mulatto child. There is another sense in which a woman engaging, specifically in the context of this clip, a white woman marrying a non-white and having a child that is able to code as non-white, is a protective maternal instinct at work. Because on account of putatively being the victim of systemic discrimination, that child will in fact be shielded from the systemic and systematic discrimination that he would face if he were as white as his mom. The white woman Asian man pairing that was highlighted in that video is relatively uncommon when it comes to white Asian pairings. 3/4 of the time the man is white and the woman is Asian. The case is almost the reverse in the case of black-white pairings. Black men with white women occur more than twice as frequently as the reverse situation of a white man with a black woman. In the marriage market, then, for whites, it's more or less a wash. What white men come up short on with black women, they make up for with their success with Asian women. Conversely, where white women come up short with Asian men, they make up for with their success with black men. Should note that there's very little sexual difference in interracial pairings when they involve a white and a Hispanic. White men with Hispanic women and Hispanic men with white women, those pairings are almost equally frequent. The source I'm using here is from Pew Research, and they show that of all newlywed intermarried couples in the United States, 22% of those interracial pairings include a white man with a Hispanic woman, and 20% include a Hispanic man with a white wife. And so in the case of Hispanics also, it's more or less a wash. The big losers in the marriage market are black women and Asian men, while the big winners are black men and Asian women. And even if you didn't explicitly know that, implicitly you probably suspected as much, merely on account of being a casual observer of American culture. When it comes to expressions of sexual frustration, often those expressions manifest in the forms of black women and Asian men. Whereas when it comes to representing sexual desire, the forms that it often takes are those of black men and of Asian women. Speaking of interracial pairings, the trailer for the second iteration of Gladiator, which is going to be it looks like it's going to be a continuation of the story from the end of the first movie, has a quite subversive interracial pairing that is being shown in the trailer, and that is of a black, presumably Nubian. The character is played by Denzel Washington. I guess he could be like Berber or some sort of North African, but Denzel Washington is sub-Saharan African by ancestry. And so in the context of first century AD Rome, he would presumably be a Nubian. He is a slave owner, and the presumed protagonist of the movie is one of his slaves who is white. He's played by Paul Mescal. The way it's portrayed and recounted and increasingly taught in the United States is that slavery was some sort of uniquely American, racially oppressive institution, when the reality really couldn't be any further from that. Almost uniquely in the history of humanity, Northern American slaves brought to North America from Africa saw a natural increase in their numbers throughout all places and in all times. Up until that point, slave populations had to perpetually be replenished because they were constantly dying at rates faster than they were reproducing. But the conditions in North America were such that slaves were taken care of well enough to survive and to reproduce. Of course, that is a horrible existence by 21st century developed world standards, slavery of any kind, but on a slavery scale over time and place, slavery in the New World. If you were going to be a slave, to use a John Rawls type of thought experiment, imagine that you're going to be a slave dropped into some society somewhere on the globe at some undetermined, at least unknowable to you, location. So unknown location, unknown time in history, you're going to be dropped in as a slave. There is scarcely a better place to be dropped in than early 19th century America. It's one of the reasons why, even after the Atlantic slave trade ended, slavery continued to be a significant political and cultural, moral, religious issue in the United States, because even though new slaves weren't coming in, the slave population was continuing to grow and would continue to grow as slavery as an institution expanded westward if it were permitted to do so. And so for Ridley Scott to produce a story of a white slave being enslaved by a black slave owner from 2,000 years ago on the other side of the world is a culturally subversive, if historically true, thing to do. While I expect to be disappointed by the second Gladiator, since sequels are almost always worse than the first in the series, with the notable exception of the second Austin Powers movie, and I'm told the second Godfather movie. I'm going to see this. The original Gladiator is my favorite movie of all time. The battle in the Colosseum depicting the Second Punic War is a phenomenal 5-minute on-screen representation of Jack Donovan's conception of the 4 tactical virtues essential to masculinity: strength, honor, courage, and mastery. If you're familiar with the movie, of course, you'll instantly recognize that strength and honor, 2 of those 4 virtues, are depicted as the motto of the Roman army, at least the one fighting on the Rhine. And so if that conceptual framework resonates with you, as it does with me, it's little wonder that I hold the movie in such high regard. The original movie's most famous line is the one in which Russell Crowe's character, Maximus, simultaneously shames and taunts a provincial gladiatorial crowd.
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained?
But I think the most profound exchange of dialogue in the movie takes place between Maximus and the character Quintus.
People should know when they're conquered.
Would you, Quintus? Would I?
It's an open question, one to which the answer could be contingent upon events shaping those the question is posed to. And in the case of Quintus, he's an illustration of how that answer can be changed over time. He's Maximus's right-hand man, and yet when the coup occurs, he has Maximus executed and has his family butchered. Or at least he attempts to have Maximus executed. He suspects it's probably not the right thing to do, although there's questions about how deeply in the know he is. He suspects that it is not the right thing to do, but he is just following orders, just keeping his head down to get by. But as the movie draws to a close, he takes the ultimate personal risk to himself and to his family by refusing to provide the Emperor Commodus with an extra weapon that would allow him to dispatch Maximus when the two are engaged in mortal combat on the floor of the Colosseum. If Commodus survives that encounter, Quintus is a dead man. Not only has he seen the fate that befell Maximus's family and was slated to befall Maximus in a director's cut, there is a scene where Commodus orders the execution of the Praetorian Guard members who were tasked with executing Maximus and failed to do so. And despite Quintus's protestations that they are good, reliable men who made an honest mistake, Commodus has them executed. These relatively low-level officials who accidentally muffed up Commodus's commands were butchered. So the idea that a much higher-ranking official in the person of Quintus intentionally defying a direct command of the emperor, well, he's done for. Just as he thought the German tribes were conquered, so he thought he, too, was a conquered man, as the movie opens. But by the end, he found out that that wasn't the case. When the moment presented itself, when the need was the most dire, he did, in fact, make the virtuous decision, even though that decision could have extracted from him the ultimate cost. And so on that inspiring note, we'll end it for this week. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.